Heed what the ancients did say, and live in the righteous way, and keep it up every day. And don't you go astray, many are lost in dismay. That's why they cannot stay, by your words you must get paid. And if not, you... Greetings. This is a Black History, Thought and Literature workshop that we call Uncovering Truths. Before we start, I expect that we've all spotted the deliberate spelling mistake in the title, but I'm hoping that you will also notice the hidden word that is within the word. That word being, if we look at the word truth, we're talking about root. The aim in uncovering truths is to open eyes and minds through the delivery of a program that will encourage a reset of the everyday thought process, bringing a change in the way that we as Black people see ourselves and our peers, and also improve the way that we are seen and perceived by others. If you were to dig down into the earth, it wouldn't necessarily be a pretty sight. Your hands would be muddy, and you would probably find lots of little creepy crawly insects, as well as plant roots. But the character of the earth's beauty is found not in the roots, but in the way the flowers will spring in its season. The various vegetables that will grace your dinner table, the green pastures and the trees. Just to show you how getting behind the truth as we see it can be a messy business. In modern Western culture, Black people have succeeded most in the fields of music, arts and sports, mainly because it isn't possible to admire true excellence in a particular physical discipline through the prism of a biased system. It is indeed a wonderful thing, really, the sight of a Bob Marley or a Muhammad Ali, a Stevie Wonder or a Pele. Very uplifting for the souls of most Black people and their good companions. What is disappointing, though, is that we don't have the same ratio of Black doctors, professors, scientists, etc., with what seems like very little demand or expectation for there to be from within our own communities. There are reasons for this, and we hope to be able to get down into the real dirt of it during this session. Learn to think. That is an interesting quote. Does it mean we should learn how and what to think? Or is it about how to make use of new information to expand the way that we think? That would be an interesting question that we will get into in a little while. The popular misconception that has stood strong in the Western world for at least the last 500 years is that Black people are not thinkers. It somehow isn't in our nature, despite being responsible for many of humans' earliest advancements. Carter G. Woodhouse, in his 1933 book, The Miseducation of the Negro, gives several examples of this, including the domestication of cattle, discovery of iron, and the development of stringed instruments, amongst others. This mode of thought has persisted, surviving in the subconscious of society with tentacles that have historically even stretched into the education system, planting seeds for a future where there is no hope, or prospect of any kind of meaningful achievement for the average black person in adult life. Any educational system that is continuing to support or encourage such views in any of its students is not providing anything in terms of a meaningful education. In the face of this, many of the black students will find themselves turning their backs on this system of education. Because of the bias that exists, now in a more covert context in the educational system, most people are unaware of there being any black thinkers who have made any particularly noticeable strides in Western society before the likes of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X in the 1960s. But there have been many great black thinkers going right back to the first days of slavery in the Americas. If it were not for all these unsung heroes who on some occasions even sacrificed their own life for the cause, it is very possible that even today the descendants of the slaves of those times will still be slaves now. George William Gordon, a Jamaican politician and campaigner for black rights during the mid-19th century, made a famous quote to the same effect decades after slavery had already been abolished there. From the slaves' perspective, they could not afford to sit back and wait for their slave master to develop a guilty conscience and decide that he was wrong to put his black man into chains. So there would be many slaves who would take it upon themselves to revolt against the system on several occasions over the decades and centuries that were to follow, with instances of uprisings taking place in all parts of the Americas. Slaves in the North, South, and in the Caribbean put up a resistance against the slave system until eventually the case for maintaining such an inhumane business had withered away during the mid-19th century, when the concession of emancipation was granted, at least for the slaves of Britain, France, and the USA. For more than 200 years, there have been several black writers of published works who have been great thinkers of their day. Some had even been former slaves, such as Oluwuda Equiano, who wrote a book in 1789 describing his life in Africa as a child and then being kidnapped away from his home to be forced into slavery in the Western world before being allowed to purchase his own freedom. There was a Harlem Renaissance that was happening during the early 20th century, which saw black people beginning to excel in the fields of literature and art in a vibrant environment that saw Jamaican Pan-African leader Marcus Garvey thrive, whilst drawing some unwanted attention for himself from some very high up places. These are just two of the great thinkers that we could be referring to instead of Charles Dickens or Winston Churchill, if education was offering to the black person a level playing field. But there are many, many more, and here are just a few. This iconic figure goes by the name of Carter G. Woodson. He was born in 1875 in Virginia, United States of America. His parents were both former slaves who, though extremely poor, were contented by the fact that they had finally been released from their physical chains that had been holding them down just a decade before his birth. As a child, his education was regularly disrupted by his responsibilities helping his father on the farm. He made up for this by self-learning as much as he could and hoping to master the various school subjects. He had hoped to attend the Douglass High School, named after the former slave and abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, when he moved to Huntington, West Virginia at the age of 17. But he would have to wait until 3 years after that before he would get his opportunity to concentrate fully on his education. He was awarded a diploma from high school in 1897 and began working as a school teacher. Continuing his own education, he went on to earn a Bachelor of Literature degree in 1903 and moved to the Philippines to take a job as a school supervisor. On his return to the United States, he started attending the University of Chicago, where he gained 2 graduate degrees in 1908. He went on to complete a PhD in history at Harvard in 1914, but despite holding a doctorate, found no university willing to hire him. Although he was a fully paid up member of the American Historical Association, he was not allowed to attend its conferences, convincing him that the white-dominated historian profession had no room for any kind of serious acknowledgement of the Black history perspective. At a national event held in Chicago celebrating 50 years of emancipation from slavery, Woodson brought together a small group of Black scholars and founded the Association for the Studying of Negro Life and History, followed swiftly by the publication of his first book, The Education of the Negro prior to 1861, and the start of a new quarterly paper called Journal of Negro History, targeting all of the various bodies involved in education of black children. Believing that education and social interaction would help solve racism, he prompted the first of what would become an annual event in the second week of February 1926, which he called Negro History Week, which would later become the 4-week-long Black History Month. A decade before, he had had some involvement with the NAACP, but found his perspective to be too radical for their conservative approach. Into the 1920s, he began having some contact with the UNIA and wrote a regular column in Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World. His views on Black history education earned him much opposition from established bodies, including some of the leading Black institutions. He also became an outspoken detractor against the Black religious and educational institutions that did little to advance racial harmony and even promoted systems of segregation. In the preface of his 1933 book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he makes the following statement. Coming back to the lead quote that I spoke a little bit about earlier, this is actually a quote by Carter G. Woodson. Learn to think. So when we look into this quote, we may be able to get a better insight into what the author is saying by looking at his background, finding out about, to some extent, what makes him tick. Like what we had just done looking at the writer profile that we just looked at. So from this quote, we're going to come up with 4 phrases or words that come to mind when we think of what he is saying or what he's trying to say or what he's referring to. So here are the 4 words that I came up with in relation to this phrase, learn to think, a bit earlier on. Expand the mind. Because when you are living day after day, doing the same thing to the point where you don't even have to pay any attention to what you're doing, your mind switches off and you just become part of the machinery. So we learn to think, we expand our minds. Be independent. Thinking for yourself, not letting yourself get drawn into situations just because it's what the crowd are doing. Is this something that is good for me? Analyzing. Check it out. If you wanted to buy a new stereo system, it would be prudent not to just buy the first one that you set your eyes on. You'd want to measure it for appropriateness in line with your needs and requirements, which is the real measure of what a solid education should be providing to each and every school child. Not just going with what's put in front of you, but working it out, inside and out. Improving living conditions. If somebody dug a dig hole and put you down into it, and they're not going to help you to get out, you are stuck in a sorry situation. The only way that things could start to improve for you is if you start to think. Okay. Having taken down these 4 phrases, what we've drawn from or inspired by looking at the quote from Carter G Woodson, which was learn to think. What we can do from there is put together a verse, a short verse or poem or short story, anything, just a couple of paragraphs, which would include the 4 phrases what we have put down. So again, I've made a short example earlier on, and I'm going to read this out to you just to give you a little idea of what or how we can put this together. So, learn to think. For so long being told what to think, how to think, when to think, thinking that that was the right way to think, thinking thoughts that have been squeezed into a tightly contained box, limiting thoughts, thoughts that make desolate any ability to expand the mind or improve living conditions. Where is that sense of adventure that once played such a big part in our lives during those carefree childhood days? Every day investigating and analysing what opportunities there could be to break through into new frontiers and extend our trodden boundaries. Those happy days of my childhood, being a member of the cool gang, the in crowd, the crew. A joy to be a part of one body, a kind of family. But gradually with maturity comes a realization and a need to be independent and free. Sometimes thinking outside of the box. Could that really be so far outside of the ordinary? All of a sudden, stubbornly refusing to be told what to think, how to think, and when to think. Living in an unsatisfactory and sorry state, now I am starting to remember how to really think. What else could there be for anybody to do if there was really a way to arrive once again at that position in life of natural contentment, and universal harmony. This is an interesting quote, and it's definitely true that if we could have harmony and unity, all our problems would be solved. Sounds simple when you look at it like that. But how simple would it be when the reality is, for the black student, the system of education is a battlefield where too much time is spent trying to overcome various obstacles and difficulties. Not the ideal environment for forming a spirit of togetherness and oneness. One of the most damaging obstacles is manifested through the way that black students are gradually convinced that any success that they may achieve is either unusual or unexpected due to their perceived natural position of disadvantage in society. This can lead to significant levels of self-doubt and even see a change in the way that they look upon their own family members and the wider community. Frederick Douglass, a former slave in America during the mid-19th century, wrote in his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, he wrote of how teaching himself to read had changed his perspective of himself and his fellow slaves. Western education in this context can have a harmful effect on our communities, potentially causing deep divisions, depression, and strife, as subconsciously the focus becomes finding ways to follow after the blessed image of whiteness. Perceived for so long throughout the last few centuries in Western culture as being centered around wealth, intelligence, righteousness, and superiority. The women also would be considered to possess a beauty far superior to that of any other kind of woman. As we allow that image of beauty to drift away from our own blackness, we start to look at the world through the spectacles of a white person. Our hair is now not straight enough, our eyes not blue enough, our skin not light enough, our noses and lips too large. This is what we have been convinced to believe over several generations, and yes, those kinds of expressions still exist today. So we have developed systems of imitation that have become now almost second nature to us, with anybody not conforming enough to this image of what is considered beauty left behind to face ridicule. As a result, self-hate and low esteem throughout the black community, though not recognized or acted upon, is clearly not an uncommon trend within the black community, and can lead to incidents of serious internal conflicts and antisocial behaviors. As Marcus Garvey says in this crucial quote from his 1923 book, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, a book of Garvey quotes compiled by his second wife, Amy Jacks Garvey. We can only achieve success through harmony and unity. But faced with a system that stacks the odds so firmly against us as a people, often referred to in terms of divide and conquer, it is in fact close to impossible for black people to be able to come together in any meaningful way, or for any positive social change to actually occur. That step towards harmony and unity would require a major rejection of any system that encourages in them self-doubt, and self-hate. Okay, so just like what we did a little bit earlier on with the Learn to Think quote by Carter G. Woodson, we're going to give you another example verse or few paragraphs um, going off this quote by Marcus Garvey, which is, "We can only achieve success through harmony and unity." I'm not going to go through the writer profile by Amy Jacks Garvey, but if you do want to read it, it is available to be read on our Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/ Saturn7 Meds, and that's Meds with a Z, MEDZ. Okay, scroll down there and you'll get the writer profile for Amy Jacks Garvey, so you can get a little bit of background with reference to this quote. So I wrote down a few phrases and words tying into this earlier on, and the four words are oneness, solidarity, overcoming diversity, and visionary strategy. Okay, and the few words, sentences, and verses that I had to write down are as follows. So, harmony and unity. One destination with so many ways to get there. Can there ever be any kind of agreement when everybody seems to know better than the other? Carving out a novel's singular way to find fame and success, only to find the barrier ahead too tough to overcome. There's got to be a better way to overcome diversity than a selfish desire for gratification and glory. Maybe it is time to develop a new visionary strategy, one that would render the impossible significantly reduced in stature to make it easily possible. Alone, the barrier is too great to be tackled, the singular force pushing against it too weak for the task. But what if we were to multiply that force of one by 2, 3, 4, or more? Encouraged to operate inseparably as a greater force of oneness, like when several cups filled with water are poured into the same bucket. Now the cement bonding the different parts of the impossible barrier will start to crumble, and the dawning of a new day and a new way can at last be seen on the horizon. I'm looking forward to that day when finally the barriers that keeps my heart shackled to pain and desperation are brought down once and for all, acknowledged almost as if they had never been there, but never forgetting that it was the hard work and solidarity of the many for one cause that ultimately brought to us such a rewarding outcome. This is another crucial quote, this time from the former slave Olawudu Equiano, who became strongly involved with the abolitionist movement in Britain towards the end of the 19th century. The motto that they used at that time, "Am I not a man and a brother?" was something that I always thought of as being degrading as an emblem to use, as one that was supposed to be asserting equal rights and justice for black people. But if we dig a little deeper and recognize the time that this goes back to and what was really going on, we can get a better understanding of what it was. What we have to remember when we look at this is that black men or black people at this time already were bound in chains and were on their knees. Therefore, for them to make this statement will have been viewed by many as a show of impertinence. In his second book, a short story called The Heroic Slave, written half a century after Equiano's campaigning, Frederick Douglass described a scene where the cruelty of an American slave master towards his slaves had reduced a young slave girl to a state of tearful despair. The slave master's response to this incursion on his feelings of privilege and superiority was to beat her for her cheek in expressing real human emotions. So for the slave to declare he was a man and a brother was indeed a statement of defiance against the system of the day, showing the strong determination that they had to be able to stand up for the most basic of human rights, which they were being denied, even if it was against all odds that they would ever achieve success. As was said right at the beginning of this session, getting deep down into and uncovering truths to reveal the roots can be a messy, or at least not a pretty business. For the slaves of Equiano's time in the Caribbean, whilst not wanting to get another whipping, they still had enough self-belief and dignity to stand up for their truth at the risk of getting another whipping. The reality is, there is only so much any man can take, and eventually he will have to stand up if he is going to be recognized in the way that he deserves to be. So by making Black history education a more significant part of the everyday program of learning, the students' knowledge development would naturally become more balanced and progressive, being free from the common distortions persisting within the present academic structures. But what should happen once we have gained a meaningful access to our Black history education and have started to benefit through this? This crucial quote is actually from a song lyric written by Kenneth Gamble, an African-American songwriter who had a very strong Black rights and Black empowerment focus during the early 70s, and originally recorded this song by a group called the OJs. It is quite significant that a song lyric should be able to make it amongst our crucial quotes, and there are many more that could also be used in this positive context. This is because within African culture, as Alawuda Equiano would put it, we are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. It wouldn't have been unusual in ancient African culture for historical events to have been recorded through the use of rhymes and rhythms, a reliable instrument in the delivery of education and learning. Should uncovering truth and revealing the root mean that we should seek revenge for the ugliness of past deeds against us, setting about the destruction of all those things that went before, symbolizing the centuries of suffering experienced by our ancestors? Would the disappearance of such bitter reminders solve the issues that we continue to contend with, And if so, wouldn't it also increase the resentment of those who've already been convinced to despise us because of the shade of our skin? Alternatively, we might choose to be more pragmatic, taking these things as a lesson from history not to be forgotten, but that we can learn from in a spirit of honesty and reconciliation to ensure that it cannot be repeated again in future times. Although this would ultimately be left as a decision for the individual to make, history would suggest the latter to be the more successful course of action. So, like what was done for the previous two crucial quotes that we looked at, I've also put a few short verses together for this crucial quote by Oluwude Equiano, using the same process as we did before. So for this quote, in wishing to avoid censure, I do not aspire to praise. If you want to give it a go for yourself, you can check out our Facebook page to read the write-up profile from Oluwude Equiano. You just need to scroll down, and when you get there, then you can read it through it, and you can come up with your own 4 phrases. So here are my 4 that I came up with earlier. Clarity of purpose, strong-willed, politeness, and motivated. And I'll read my example short verse for you that was inspired from this quote. Censure. Is it possible to trod carefully, never causing offence to anybody when offence is so easily taken? Should I speak the truth, my truth, those hidden truths, and not care for the discomfort it may cause? Politeness is one of the greatest kindnesses, but what is its value if its only purpose is to suppress the truth? In my heart there is a clarity of purpose, a vision of how I would like things to be. Why should it not be an offence to me that somebody should take offence to the very beating rhythm that is, and always will be, so central to the essence of who I am? Surely, if I am motivated by a spirit of fairness, tolerance, and love, any offence that could be felt by anybody is at best overspent and misguided. Therefore, I must stand firm with bravery, ready to speak my truth whenever it is necessary, not forgetting that hearts are gentle and should be treated in that way, but maintaining with dignity a strong-willed determination and focus for the sake of self-preservation and truth. The crucial quotes exercise would form the final part of this workshop. In this section of the workshop, participants would have a selection of quote cards, all with quotes written by some of our great black thinkers, from which they will pick one. The appropriate writer profile, giving them the background information about each author, would also be given to them. Using the quote for inspiration, they will note down 4 points in relation to it, just like what I did for the Learn to Think quote. And they will try to write a short verse containing all 4 of the points that were noted down. Here are just a few of the quote cards that we would be using in the workshop. Why don't you give it a go yourself? Maybe you could use one of the Carter G Woodson quotes in this video and start from there. You never know how you could be inspired.
Heed what the ancients did say, and live in the righteous way, and keep it up every day. And don't you go astray, many are lost in dismay. That's why they cannot stay, by your words you must get paid. And if